I would like to introduce our first speaker. Gai is an international public speaker in the fields of leadership, excellence, and goal achieving. He's also a mentor to professionals and entrepreneurs. He gives legal and financial consulting as an accountant and lawyer in the business sector, a very interesting combination. And moreover, on top of that, he founded a social organization that aims to empower and advance people with disabilities through the sports. Now, each of us has climbed or is about to climb a Mount Everest in our lives. So Gai, please share your experience and learnings to help us out. The stage is yours.
Thank you very much. And hello to everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. I will now share the presentation that will accompany us during the talk. If you have any questions about the things that I'm talking about, just feel free to share them in the group chat. And if we have enough time, we'll try to address the questions. I will also be on the Agile couch later, so you're more than invited to over there just after my talk. Okay, so let's begin. So my story begins in my childhood. Since the day I remember myself, I always dreamed to become an Olympic athlete and to represent my country, Israel, in the Olympic Games. They actually say in my family that I loved running since the day I was born. When I was a baby and I was crying, so my father used to carry me in his arms, just like that, and he used to run together with me in circle. And he told me that this was the only way to make me calm down and stop crying. And so it's not a coincidence, because my father himself, he was an athlete in his youth. And so I guess this is why running has always been something very central and significant throughout my childhood. And when I was 16 years old, I was already a competitive long distance runner. I remember myself training and practicing really, really hard so that one day I will be able to realize that dream and represent Israel in the Olympic Games. But then I turned 18, I finished high school, and about that time I realized that I will not be able to realize that ambition just because I just wasn't good enough. And I basically gave up on my Olympic dream and moved on with my life. And now, I don't know if you're familiar with that, but in Israel, when you turn 18, so military service is mandatory. So I had to join the Israeli army, and I joined a very special unit, which is the Israeli Air Force Rescue and Evacuation Unit. Basically, what we used to do is to fly in helicopters and do rescue operations from many different scenarios and situations. So here in the pictures, you can see just a bit of the operational activity that we used to have. And I think that probably one of the most significant characteristics of the operational activity is that it was very diverse, meaning that when I used to go out on a rescue operation, I usually didn't know the most important things until I got to the surface. For example, the amount of people injured, the types of injury, the type of medical treatment that I need to give, or the equipment that I need to use in order to rescue them. And so probably coping with uncertainty and coping with stressful situations is one of the most significant elements of being a rescue soldier. But I think that beyond all the dynamic characteristics of the service, one of the most important things is constant. And it's the fact that in a rescue operation, you will always work with people, with human beings. And the people that I met, the people that I rescued during my service were people in the most complex situations you can think of. Most of them were severely injured, people who are afraid, sometimes people who lost someone who is very close to them from their own family, maybe. And so I think that I learned that probably one of the most important abilities and capabilities for a combat soldier in that specific unit is to be able, within a stressful situation, approach a person, communicate with him at eye level, and be able to to help him move forward to a better place, meaning to save him. And there's no doubt that that service exposed me for the first time in my life to these kind of situations, but it also gave me a lot of tools to do the things that I do today, which are in completely different fields, and I will talk more about them later on. So this is another picture of myself from around that period, together with my grandfather, Abraham. And that picture was taken in the Israeli Memorial Day for the fallen soldiers, which is for our family a very important day. And the reason is the guy in the picture. This is Moshe, Moses in English. Moshe is my uncle. He's my father's older brother. Here he's about 17 years old. You can see he's wearing his running uniform, and it's not a coincidence because Moshe was one of the best long distance runners in Israel back at the time. I'm talking about the 60s. But about 2 years later, the year was 1973, and Moshe was already 19 years old, and he was a combat soldier in an elite unit of the Israeli military. In 1973 in Israel, there was a very big war called Yom Kippur War. It's probably one of the most traumatic events in the history of Israel. Thousands of wounded and killed civilians and soldiers. And on the last day of the war, Moshe and his team got one last mission. They had to rescue a team of paratroopers that were stuck inside a town called Suez, which is located in the north of Sinai Desert in Egypt. The picture that you see now was taken just before they went on that mission. Moshe is the guy with the glasses on the left side of the picture. I'm just marking him now. They got the order, went out, and it wasn't more than 2 or 3 minutes when an Egyptian missile hit them, and Moshe was killed on the spot. In these moments, my grandparents lost their older son. My father remained an only child. He was just 16 years old. And so it's probably the deepest crisis in my family's history, but my grandparents chose not to give up. They actually always told me that when Moshe was killed, they decided to choose life. And the year after Moshe was killed, they brought new life to the world, Tal. This is Tal, my aunt, who was born as a result of Moshe's death, meaning that if Moshe would not have been killed, Tal would never have been born. My grandmother gave birth to her when she was about 44 years old. My father, her older brother, is 16 years older than her. And so we're not a regular family in terms of age differences between us, but Tal for us, she was not born as a memory for Moshe. Tal for us is a symbol for hope and for optimism and for the power of life. 10 years later, I was born. And when I was born, my parents decided to name me after Moshe. My full name is Gai Moshe. Here you can see me when I was about 1 year old, together with Tal, who was about 10 years old back then. And in this point, I would like to show you my family. So here's my family, my two parents on the right side of the picture, and my younger sisters, Noah and Shir. I'm the older brother in the family. And that picture was taken about 15 years ago. And one of these days, I remember that my father and I were just browsing the internet, and we suddenly came across this very strange and unusual ad. It said, wanted, a runner with soul. Now, I don't know how to explain why, but there was something about the wording of the ad that really made us curious. There were no details, but we saw a phone number and we decided to call. And when we called, we discovered the ad was published by a guy called Beza. This is Beza, exactly my age, 37 years old today, about 20 years old back then. And Beza was born blind. When he was born in Ethiopia, the minute his father realized that he just had a blind son, he decided to abandon him. So Beza basically grew up without a father. When he was about 7 years old, he immigrated to Israel. And about 15 years ago, when Beza was around 20 years old, he decided he wanted to pursue his biggest dream and he wanted to start running. But a blind person can't run alone, right? He needs someone to guide him, to take care of him. He needs someone to be his eyes. And that was the reason why Beza was looking for someone to run with. And we saw the ad he published, and we just gave Beza a call and we decided to meet. We scheduled the meeting for an athletic stadium in Tel Aviv, 4:30 a.m. And I actually remember the day of the meeting. It was the middle of the night. My father and I woke up. We wore our running uniform, went to Tel Aviv in Israel. And then just outside its athletic stadium, there's a very big parking lot. And try to imagine the situation. It's 4:30 a.m. before sunrise. It's completely dark outside. You can't see anything. There's nobody there. My father and I got to this big, empty, dark parking lot, and we were looking around for Beza. And after a few minutes, I remember that we saw him suddenly sitting there on the pavement with his running uniform, just waiting for us to arrive. And then we approached Beza, and Beza was actually the first blind person I've ever met in my life, meaning I knew nothing about being blind. I knew nothing about guiding a blind person. So I remember that I just approached Beza, introduced myself, and then Beza introduces himself. And the first thing that Beza told us about himself is that he wasn't only blind, he was also a heavy smoker, and he has never run before. And I remember that the first impression we had is that Beza just can't run. I mean, he was in the poorest condition you could imagine. No relationship whatsoever between Beza and sports. But on the other hand, the opportunity to do something that would be for us challenging, beyond ordinary, brought us to make the decision and try to go with Beza on a run. So how do you run with a blind person? We're using a connecting strap. It has two loops in both of its ends. You can see that in the picture. And each one of the runners connects his wrist in one end of the strap, just like Beza and I are connected. And this is actually what allows us to run together hand in hand. And I actually remember the first time that I connected my right hand to one end of the strap, and then Beza was connected to the other side, and we started running. And that was actually the first time in my life running connected physically to another person. And I can share with you that the experience was very clumsy. And very uncomfortable because Beza pulled me all over the place. I had to run very slowly and adjust my running pace to his running pace. And at some point I realized that when I'm running with him, all of the competitive element of the run became completely unimportant. And the only important thing was the connection and the relationship between Beza and I, because Beza had to trust me completely without seeing me, that no matter what happens, I will do my job as a guide properly. And so I had to look out for obstacles and look for water places to drink water and look out for the people that are approaching us. And I had to communicate everything to Beza because we helped to build trust between us. And if there's one takeaway that I took from that first experience together with Beza is to, when approaching a new person, and you can take that to leadership or management or whatever, if you approach these kind of situations with a learner mindset, with a beginner's mindset, trying to ask questions, trying to understand as much as you can the other person's point of view, that would give you a lot of tools later on to have a greater impact and influence over the other person in a way that will empower him and will help him to develop himself. And so with Beza, the first time we ran was not more than 2 or 3 minutes. It was very short, but we had a very good time together. So we decided to meet again after a week. And after 2 weeks, we met 2 times. And after a few weeks, my father and I, we found ourselves meeting Beza almost every morning for a run. And Beza stopped smoking and he started to improve. And from 2 or 3 minutes, we moved up to 2 or 3 kilometers, and then 5 kilometers and 10 kilometers. We started competing together. And after a few months of running, we saw that Beza was feeling quite comfortable in these kind of distances. We decided to up the bar to set ourselves a challenge, and we enrolled for a half a marathon race. Half a marathon race, it's a 21 kilometers race. The average beginner will take around 2.5 hours to complete that distance. And I actually remember that as we were crossing the finish line together with Beza in this first half marathon, he was so exhausted that the minute he crossed the finish line, he just fainted. And I remember he was lying there on the track, couldn't move himself with his eyes closed. And my father and I felt really nervous because we never saw Beza in these kind of situations. So I immediately went to bring Beza some water. My father helped him to lift his legs, and I went back and I made some wind on his face. And all of that situation, it happened on the finish line of a race, which is usually a very crowded place. And people saw us together with Beza, so they approached us and they said, wow, where do you go? We didn't know that blind people can run. Will we see you in the next marathon here in Israel? And then suddenly Beza wakes up and he says, you know something? Marathon sounds really interesting to me. Can you tell me a little bit more about it? So we told Beza, well, Beza, as you know, a marathon race, it's a 42 kilometers race, considered to be one of the most difficult challenges that a person can do. In order to be able to complete that distance, one will have to start practicing at least 6 months in advance. During that period, you will have to run almost every morning, because within an average week, a marathon runner will complete around 100 kilometers. And then within a month, it's few hundreds of kilometers, and within half a year, it's few thousands of kilometers. And if you're able to survive that period without getting dropped out or injured, the first marathon in your life will take you between 4 to 5 hours. Okay, this is about the amount of effort that you need to put in. But in these moments, we already made a decision. We were about to try and participate in the next marathon in Israel together with Beza in order to complete the distance. And actually, a few months later, in January 2006, we were already on the start line of the biggest marathon in Israel together with Beza, running his first ever marathon. Now, in a marathon race, every marathoner knows that there's a very well-known phenomenon called the wall. And the wall is actually the biggest crisis of the race. It's the point in the run after 30, 35 kilometers, you're already 2 or 3 hours on your feet. The amount of effort is very high. And the amount of energy in your body just drops. And then what you feel is pains all over your body, your legs and your stomach and your hands and your head. Everything really, really aches. And this is where the real mental and physical struggle begins. Not that it's easy before that, but this is a very extreme experience. And you have to understand that the wall will come only in the first marathon, because during the training period, you will not get to that kind of distance. You will get to about 75% of the full distance. And this is why the wall is probably the biggest coping for a person who runs his first marathon. In that specific marathon, I remember that I was standing just outside the finish line. There's this final lap of 300 or 400 meters where all the people are gathering in order to cheer the runners that are finishing. And my father and Beza were supposed to finish the race together. And I remember that I waited there. I was really, really anxious to see if Beza will be able to cope with the full distance. And after a while, I was waiting. I remember that I suddenly saw my father and Beza entering that final lap. And they were sprinting, and because of the excitement, the strap was torn. And then Beza tells my father's name is Ofer. He tells my father, Ofer, can you hold my hand? And the next thing that I saw is exactly that picture. My father and Beza running together, hand in hand, crossing together the finish line. I remember the excitement of looking at my father. He was 48 years old back then, running together with Beza. And when they crossed the finish line, Beza made a result of 3 hours and 45 minutes, which was an amazing result for him. But Beza is also a very consistent person. The minute he crossed the finish line, he fainted. He was lying there on the course, completely exhausted. But my father and I were not nervous at all, because we knew Beza very well by then. So each one of us had his own role. I went to bring him some water, and my father helped him to lift his legs. And I went back and I made some, wind on his face. And all of that situation happened on the finish line of the biggest marathon in Israel, thousands of people. And people a bit knew us a little bit by then. So they approached us and they say, wow, where do you go? We didn't know the blind people can run. Will we see you in the Olympic Games in Beijing? And then Beza wakes up and he says, you know something, Olympics sounds quite interesting. Can you tell me a little bit more about it? So we told Beza, well, Beza, as you know, the Olympic Games are the biggest sports event in the world, where all the biggest athletes come to compete. And just after the Olympic Games, there are the Paralympic Games, where all the greatest athletes with physical disabilities come to compete. And it's a huge event, takes place in the same location where the regular Olympics takes place. And in order to become a Paralympic athlete, you have to be with very high mental and physical capabilities. And very few people are able to realize that dream and get to the Paralympics. But we already made a decision in that moment that we wanted, together with Beza, to realize a childhood dream and to try to represent Israel in the Paralympic Marathon in Beijing. How do we do it? We knew nothing about it, not about the Paralympics or the Paralympic Marathon. So we went back home and we researched a little bit, and pretty fast we discovered that in order to get to the Paralympic Marathon, Beza had to meet two criteria. The first one, he had to be one of the top 30 blind marathon runners in the world, okay, top 30. The second criteria was Beza had to run a qualifying result, a minimum result, which is the result that if you run that or faster, then you're inside the Paralympic team. And then we took Beza's result, 3 hours and 45 minutes, compared it to the world ranking. And we discovered that Beza was ranked around 500 in the world. The result that he had to do was 3 hours and 18 minutes, which was about half an hour faster than the result he just made in our first marathon. We had a time frame of about 2 years. And with that, we actually realized that our chances to get to the Olympic Games were almost zero. Almost none. Even marathon coaches that we approached to in order to participate in the Olympics, all of them told us that they looked at Beza and they told us, well, this person, Beza, he's a heavy smoker all of his life, just started running, was born blind. There's no way that a person like that within 2 years will be able to reach more than 400 places higher in the world ranking and run half an hour faster. It will not happen with Beza, forget about it. And actually from that point, we made a decision that we're doing another step in order to realize our dream, despite what everybody else told us. And the next step that we did was to choose another marathon. And the next marathon that we chose to compete was the Berlin Marathon in Germany, which is probably one of the biggest and fastest marathons in the world. 50,000 people compete there every year. 4 world records in the marathon race were set in Berlin. And so for us, that was probably the best choice we could have done. And the picture that you see now was taken in Berlin just 2 days before the competition. The reason why I'm showing you that specific picture is the guy that is sitting on the wheelchair. His name is Yoel Sharon. And Yoel is actually the person who helped Beza to publish the ad Wanted to Run with Soul a few years earlier. Okay, the same ad that brought us to meet Beza. And that was the reason why he decided to join us to Berlin. 2 days before the competition, we sat with Yoel for a dinner. We had a conversation, just a regular chat. But then at some point of the conversation, Yoel Sharon started telling us about himself and the reason why he was sitting on the wheelchair. And he told us that he was actually wounded more than 30 years ago in the Yom Kippur War, on the last day of the war, as a combat soldier in Suez in Sinai Desert. Now, he described the same event where Moshe was killed. So we immediately told him about Moshe, my uncle. And the minute he heard the name Moshe, the name of my uncle, he told us that he knew Moshe because he was Moshe's commander. He was the one who sent my uncle on his last mission. And if you remember the picture that I showed you before, so Moshe is the guy with the glasses on the left side of the picture. And this is Yoel Sharon in the middle of the picture in front of everyone. It turned out that the same event that killed my uncle is the event that put Yoel Sharon in a wheelchair for the rest of his life. More than that, in a way, we realized that the same event that took my uncle away from us is the event that eventually brought us and Beza together, because 20 years later, Yoel Sharon established here in Israel an activity, an outdoor sports activity for people with disabilities. Through that, he met Beza, helped him to publish the ad, the same ad that by coincidence we saw on the internet. And all of the closure happened in Berlin just 2 days before the competition. By the way, what is extreme sports activities for people with disabilities? So for example, it means rappelling on wheelchairs, like the guy in the picture, and many other really cool activities like scuba diving or sailing or cycling. And this is actually how I got exposed working with people with disabilities. I've been doing that for more than 15 years now, in parallel to my career as a lawyer and an accountant. I would like to go back now to the Berlin Marathon. The picture that you see now was taken in Berlin in the halfway point. Usually when my father and I are running together with Beza, so we split the distance. It means that I run with Beza the first half of the marathon, and then my father replaces me and run with Beza all the way to the end. Beza is the only poor person who has to run a full marathon each and every time. But in Berlin, Beza crossed the finish line after 3 hours and 26 minutes, which is about 20 minutes faster than the result we made in our first marathon just a few months before that. And so this is a result that nobody believed we will be able to do. And it made me think, what would have happened if we were listening to all of these people who told us that there's no way we can reach this kind of level of running? So for sure, we would never have discovered what is our true ability. But more than that, I think that I learned that the responsibility and the power that we have to influence our lives is much bigger than we usually believe. And I think that there's many places in our lives where we take decision accounting on based on the amount of support and encouragement that we get from the people around us. But bottom line is that the responsibility for the way our lives looks like is first and foremost on ourselves. And if you want to live a certain type of life, it's our responsibility to do the things in order to get to our goals. In Berlin, I can tell you that once people saw the result that we did, coaches wanted to coach us. They got us into the Israeli national team. And so it opened a lot of doors for us. But the source of that change was the risk that we took on our process. So from there on, we started competing all over the world in order to set the minimum for Beijing. And after about a year of failures, we got to our last chance marathon in Amsterdam. That marathon took place just a few months before the Olympic Games. So we basically knew that if we're not setting the result in Amsterdam, there will not be a later chance. The first part of the marathon went great. Beza felt good. We ran according to our running program. We got to the halfway point. My father replaced me. And then I cut towards the 39th kilometers point because we decided to run together the last 3 kilometers of the race. And a few kilometers later, when I met Beza in that 39th kilometers point, I met a completely different person from the one I left at the halfway point. First of all, he was running very slowly. He was barely able to lift his legs. He was complaining about pains all over his body. He was basically in the wall, the biggest crisis of the race, the one that I described before. And so I think that the most important role of my father and myself in these kind of situations is not only to be able to be Beza's eyes, it's more about being his friends, being able to support him, to help him cope with the difficulties. I think the relationship and the connection between the guides and the runner are probably the most important element in these kind of processes. In whatever process you can think of leadership and working with other people, I think the deeper connection you have with them, the more you are able to understand them and support them and give them a greater influence in order to get the common goals. And it was working the same for us here in the marathon. And so a few kilometers later, we already got into towards the finish line in the Olympic Stadium in Amsterdam. And I remember that I saw the finish line just in front of me, and I look at the watch, and the minute I saw the result, I spread our country's flag, the Israeli flag. We crossed the finish line after 3 hours and 15 minutes. We made the qualifying result for Beijing, and I would like to share with you these last few meters in the Amsterdam Marathon.
הכניסה לאצטדיון הייתה אחד הרגעים המרגשים. אני רץ צמוד יד ביד עם בזה, וגיא רץ לידינו עם דגל ישראל פתוח. אותם רגעים ידענו שהגענו לבייג'ינג.
Few seconds later, Beza fainted on the course, but he was happy. He fainted with a smile on his face, a big smile, because we were now on our way towards the Olympic Games. And a few months later, we were already in Beijing. And Beijing was an amazing place during the Olympics, but the most important location for us was the stadium behind me here, the Bird's Nest, which is considered to be one of the biggest athletic stadiums in the world, 91,000 people in every competition. And for a marathon runner, what probably the biggest fantasy to realize is to represent your country in the Olympic Games and get to the final lap inside the athletic stadium. It's probably the highest summit that a marathon runner can get to. The Olympic Marathon was an outstanding experience. This is the start line, actually. You can see Beza in the middle of the picture over here, and I am just near him. And everything for us went according to plan up until the 25th kilometers point, where Beza got injured in his right leg's muscle. And from that point on, there was a struggle that began. Beza was running very slowly. He was half limping, half running. My father replaced me at that point, so I couldn't know exactly what was happening with Beza once I left him. I just remember that I got to the finish line. I was completely disconnected from Beza and my father, but then I got to the finish line. I saw my family. I told them what happened to Beza. And then there was this one point where the track was completely empty, and all of the people in the stadium waited to see who is the next athlete to enter the stadium. And after a few moments of silence, they suddenly announced my father and Beza. A few seconds later, they entered the stadium. My father raised his hand towards the audience. And then all of the people in the audience, 91,000 people who saw Beza was barely able to run, just started to stand up and clap their hands for Beza. And I remember myself standing there on the finish line, and I suddenly reminded that just a few years before that, we were meeting Beza in this dark parking lot. He was a heavy smoker. He has never run before. He was looking for someone to run with just for 2 or 3 minutes. And we couldn't even imagine that one day we will get to that final lap of the Olympic Marathon. And I would like to share with you now what happened just a few meters before Beza crossed the finish line.
האצטדיון היה מלא ב-90,000 צופים. אני כמובן מתאר לבזה כל הריצה, מה קורה, ובזה עם כל הכוח שאני אומר לו, תרים את היד, וברגע שהוא מרים את היד, הייתה שאגה, 90,000 איש. נראים לנו.
שמחתי לשמוע את הקהל, כי ידעתי שזה סוף, זה נגמר.
וכשהיינו 35 מטר מהסיום, עשיתי דבר שלא עשיתי אותו מעולם. אני שחררתי את הרצועה מבזה, פעם ראשונה. שחררתי את זה, רצתי לידו ככה איזה חצי מטר מאחוריו, נתתי לו לרוץ.
ממש סבלתי מכאבים, אבל איך אומרים? עוד בי שמתי בחיים שלי.
So that was the Olympic Marathon. I think that the moment of releasing the strap exemplifies in a very nice way, metaphorically, what is the goal when we are working with people as leaders. And in a way, when we meet a person for the first time, we put a metaphoric connecting strap. We are connected to him, and then we help him to do these first steps. But what we want to actually create is a sense of ability. We want to create independence. We want to help the person to get to that point when we can release the strap, and then he can go on his own journey without us having to be there just next to him in each and every step that he does. And I always try to think when I'm working with people, what are the things, the tools that I give them that will serve them in their own journey without me having to be there. And I think that this is my mindset. This is my philosophy when leading people. 3 weeks after the Olympic Games, we decided to realize another dream that we had. And we went on a journey in the Himalayas towards Mount Everest, which is the highest mountain in the world. It's a 2 weeks journey, begins in an altitude of about 3,000 meters above sea level. And from there, you climb up towards the 5,000 and 6,000 meters above sea level. And this is where the environment and the conditions go to the extreme. The trails are very dangerous to walk. The temperatures drop below zero. The oxygen level in the air is very thin, so it's very difficult to breathe. And on top of all that, you add Beza, a blind person. And I can, up until today, remember that as one of the most extreme and challenging experiences that I've ever had in my life, because we had so many situations that we never even imagined that we'll go through being there with Beza. I think that what I learned from that experience is that these difficult situations are the ones that create the deepest human relationship between people, right? When people see us in our vulnerable states, they actually feel closer to us. And I think that it's a great tool to be vulnerable, to be able to be open towards other people in order to be more connected and more influential person on them. And so beyond that, it was probably the most beautiful places I've ever been to, including that viewpoint towards the Everest mountain, which is the mountain in the left side of the picture. And now I'd like to, when we went back from that journey to Israel, I wanted to take the experience that we went through with Beza and translate it into something that will have a larger social impact. And so I started by establishing a running group for people with disabilities. It started as a very small project of 2 or 3 people and some volunteers that I started coaching. But after a few years, it became a social organization that is called 180 Degrees, in which we have running and walking groups for people with disabilities. We work with people with all sorts of disabilities. And so for each person with disability, there's at least one volunteer who runs together with him, hand in hand, from the first step that he makes. And the vision here is not only about making sports accessible for other people, it's more about building bridges and connecting people from different sectors in society. And I truly believe that running is a great tool that bridges between people, that brings people together, because it helps people to communicate, it helps people to set common goals and common challenges and go through the difficulties together. And I think that in the end of the road, it helps them to get to know each other despite the gaps. And so I think that some of the things that I learned during that journey that I went through, and we have today hundreds of people that are training together with us, adults and youth and children, and they taught me some of the most important things in life, like how important it is to be human, how important it is to look at the other person at eye level, meaning not to patronize, not to feel sorry. But I think that mainly I learned that it is so important to put more emphasis on the journey, on the process, rather than just the finish line and the results that we have. And putting emphasis on the journey is meaning that you look, who are the people who are surrounding you? What are the feelings that you feel? How do you cope with different experiences throughout the day? And in a way, in 180, what I'm trying to create is a place where people can better communicate, where people can grow and develop themselves. And the finish line is sometimes only an excuse for us to go through the journey. And the quality of the journey that we go through is much more important, I believe, than the end result. One last thing that I would like to share with you So the girl that you see here in the left side of the picture, her name is Karmit. She's visually impaired. She's one of our athletes. But I would like to focus on the volunteer that is running just next to her. The name of the volunteer is Adi. And Adi is my wife. We met each other 10 years ago when she first came to volunteer in one of the groups. Today we are already married. We have two kids, Danielle and Charlie. You can see they're pretty small. They don't let me sleep straight nights, but I can tell you that whenever I hold them in my arms and I help them to stop cry, it reminds me that when I was a baby and I was crying, my father used to carry me in his arm just like that. And he had to run together with me in circles in order to make me stop crying. And so I can tell you that Danielle and Charlie know about running from their first days. This is Danielle when he was competing for the first time in his life. And I will end with two final messages that I would like to deliver. I think when I became a father, it made me think a little bit deeper about what I want to teach my children. What kind of people would I like them to be? And there's a lot of things in this topic, but two very important things in my eyes, in my view, is first of all, to be able to be empathetic, meaning to be sensitive to other people without having to experience the same difficulties that other people experience, but just being inclusive and sensitive and be able to reach out and help them. But not less important, or even more, is to be sensitive to ourselves and not to be afraid to dream big dreams and to aspire for the highest places, and to do the difficult things sometimes in life without having all the supports that we sometimes expect. I do believe that the most difficult places are the places that help us to discover our true abilities and to fulfill our true potential. And I believe that every person has his own Mount Everest or Olympic Games. So I wish for you that you will have as many Everest as possible and that you will conquer at least some of them. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. That was very, very, I would say, touching and very inspiring and very personal. So I guess the audience, well, I don't have to guess. I'm pretty sure the audience really appreciates you sharing your story. So a couple of questions. So we have a saying that in order to be taught, the student needs to be ready to be taught, right? It needs to be, he or she needs to be ready. Now, if I rephrase this to something different, and if I put this in the context of your story, how did Beza help you to help him?
Well, I think that it wasn't intentional, but some of the first time that we ran together, we used to fall in places. I didn't notice, pavements and people, and I didn't know all of the things that I learned throughout the way. And by falling together and having these difficult small experiences, and for him to be patient with me. And whenever we fell down, he was smiling and he said, don't worry about it, Guy, you will learn, everything is okay. So I think his patience and his willingness to share with me and go through with me this experience of growing together really helped me to better understand him and to want to understand him, because there were no conflicts, at least around these topics. So he was patient and I was patient, and together we were really into getting to know each other the best way possible. And we invested in our relationship, not in our running ability, and investing in our relationship helped us to do everything else later.
That's a very beautiful answer, because if I just take your words and put those words in a business context, it's exactly the same, right? Focus not on the competencies, or in your case, running, right? You focus on relationship building first, empathy, and that's how you help each other, right?
Exactly.
All right, we have a few questions from the audience. I wanna go with them right now. So the first is, how did you find the connection? I'm sure you touched on that already a little bit, but still, maybe on a highlight. How did you find the connection? What was the best question you asked yourself to succeed running with Beza?
How did I find the best train for me to run with Beza?
Yes.
The best way for me to run. Okay, so I think that I had to put effort in two levels. I had to maintain my running ability. I had to take responsibility that I will, first of all, be a good runner. So I had to train by myself. I had to set an example for him because we were a team. So I had to see myself as a part of a team and know that whatever I do impacts the other members of the team. In this case, my father and Beza. And also I had to see myself as a person who have to not only help Beza run physically, but also help him to cope mentally with different situations. And I think that every leadership role is complex by these two parts, the mental part and the professional part. Both are important equally, at least.
Okay, thank you. We have another question. People are just curious. What's your personal best for 10K, 10 kilometers?
It's not that good, but it's okay. It's 34 minutes for 10K. Okay. It's nice.
Yeah, I hope the curiosity was satisfied. And very last question, in the interest of time, how do you find the optimal running pace when you train with the other person, in this particular case with Beza?
Through training, when you train together, when you practice, the more you practice, then the more you create that chemistry with one another, and then you feel like what is the level of effort that is right for the running. It's a matter of experience. When you're really experienced, you know how you should spread the energy and the efforts throughout the race. So the more you practice, the better you are.
All right, guys. So let's wrap this up with what would you say to a person? What would be your punchline to someone who tells you something is not possible?
I would say what I finished with in my talk. If you put your focus on the journey, if you put your focus on your way of life, that would eventually create the right results for you. Not necessarily your intentional results, but I dreamed about the Olympics. I did eventually something else completely. And unexpectedly, I got to realize my dream, but in another way. So you set the right way of living mentally and physically and socially, and you behave the right way. You take care of yourself and other people around you. Good things will happen.